Thank you, Mark, for joining us today and lending your significant expertise to this podcast. We're going to invite you to give an overview of the issue of redistricting today. Just tell us a little bit about the basics, how this process works, a little bit on gerrymandering, a little bit on the court case that's currently before the Supreme Court, and then we're going to go to questions.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation. The redistricting process is the process of redrawing representative districts around the country. Every 10 years, the U.S. Constitution provides for the government to conduct an enumeration, a count, a census. That then provides the basis on which representational districts, members of the House of Representatives, are divided across the country. Following every 10 years, the population changes, districts get moved around. That's the apportionment part of the redistricting process. And then redistricting requires the recasting of representational districts at every level of government, ranging from members of Congress down to school boards, township trustees, any type of representational district. The U.S. Constitution, Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, requires some degree of population equality. So following the census every 10 years, we have the redistricting process, which tends to be quite controversial and quite litigious. It's quite good for the lawyers because we're litigating everywhere across the country. I'm not so sure that's good for the Republic, but it's certainly good for the lawyers. And the reason why we're doing it is the stakes are very high. How you draw the districts impacts significantly on who sits in the seat. So that process is very controversial, and the regulation of it is, or the limitations imposed by the U.S. Constitution and statutes, are quite complex. So we have lots of fighting and lots of litigation. I used to joke that it wouldn't be possible to have more redistricting litigation unless we admitted more states to the Union. That, of course, turned out to have been wrong. We can have multiple pieces of litigation, and following the last census, we've had multiple pieces of litigation in most of the states around the country. So in this context, you hear a lot of people talk about gerrymandering. And the simple definition of gerrymandering is the drawing of representational districts in a manner perceived to be unfair. Now, who perceives what, and what's unfair is, of course, in the eye of the beholder. And there's a lot of dispute over what that really means. The phrase itself, it comes from the governor, a Massachusetts colonial period governor, by the name of Eldridge Gerry. So those of us who are sort of redistricting aficionados would generally try to pronounce it as gerrymandering rather than gerrymandering, but we basically have lost that dispute. But it's a process of drawing districts that at least someone perceives as being unfair. It can be unfair politically, it can be unfair on a racial or ethnic basis, it can be unfair simply because it doesn't have what you want in the district. I've been involved in litigation where people were upset because their mother wasn't in the district. Literally, if you can believe that, they were upset, they were participating in litigation because when the lines were drawn, their mother was drawn out of the district. Now that seems to be incredible, but there are numerous examples of that. That doesn't provide you much of a basis for successful litigation, but it most certainly motivates some people to be involved in litigation. So the legal structure of the process, the Constitution requires, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, that congressional districts be as nearly equal as practicable. Basically, what that means most of the time when you're advising people drawing congressional districts, you're telling them to make them absolutely equal in population. when you're drawing legislative districts or other types of representational districts, they need to be equal, but not quite as equal. In other words, the courts have traditionally permitted lower level of representational districts to have some type of flexibility in the joints, relatively small flexibility in the population joints. So there used to be a lot of litigation over population. Those issues have been resolved. And now most of the litigation arises in the context of racial and ethnic issues, either through the Voting Rights Act or through the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And that has, in this last cycle, spawned literally dozens and dozens of pieces of litigation across the country following the last census. The issues are complex, the stakes are high. That, of course, is the absolute perfect recipe for gerrymandering and perfect recipe for lots of litigation. When you're looking at drawing plans, there's a requirement for them to be fair on a racial basis and on an ethnic basis. And the process used to be outside the court process. Up until the mid-1960s, in the one person, one vote revolution, most of the redistricting activities, the courts took the position they were political activities, so non-justiciable, not subject to court intervention, court decision-making. That changed with Baker v. Carr, Reynolds v. Sims, and the court moved into the political thicket. At the same time, in the mid-60s, the Federal Voting Rights Act was passed, which was an attempt finally to enforce the promise of the 15th Amendment. Those two in combination changed American politics in a very fundamental way. Before that period, political power was, in the United States, tilted to some degree to rural areas because of population inequality of districts. Additionally, a large section of the country was a one race, one party operation. The 64 Voting Rights Act and the follow-on enforcement of it basically blew that process up and turned the process in the southern states basically in a multi-party, multi-racial political process. Prior to the two of those, the Democratic Party totally controlled the process, excluding Republicans and Black voters. That changed in the 60s. And so we have a very different political process before this sort of break period in the mid-60s. So we're looking at something that really fundamentally changed the process. Of course, this fundamental change in the process did pull the courts into the political thicket and involve the courts much more into this type of political activity, forcing them to sort of look at plans and making some determinations on the notions of what's a gerrymander, what's a fair plan and not a fair plan. And sometimes that can be very difficult to pull out because ultimately the line drawing process is a political process. How you draw the lines determine who sits in the seat. So hope that helps as sort of an overview. It is shockingly difficult to draw lines politically because what you're doing basically are impacting the political careers of the people. Lines are generally drawn in most states through a political process, usually in the state legislature, usually as a bill requiring a governor's signature. That process, when you start drawing the lines for legislative chambers and for congressional chambers, determines who sits in a seat. It's a little bit of a musical chair. When the music stops, there are not going to be seats for everybody. And so you're sitting in a chamber and you are through the line drawing process, effectively removing certain people through the chamber. And that's a difficult thing to do with people that you're working with. And it has enormous political and, in fact, personal consequences. So that's the reason why it's such. Most legislators, if you talk to them about this, who have experience in this area, will tell you that this is the single most politically difficult thing for a legislative chamber to do, more difficult than doing a state budget. So it's because it's personal. When I told you the little story about somebody living in a district, wanting their mother in a district, that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about the notion of, what do I represent? Who should be in my district? And that's a very important impact on if you're a member, on your life and success. But who represents a different area certainly impacts upon how influential they are. And that goes sort of at all levels, from congressional seats down to local seats, down to school boards. You got a school board member that lives in your neighborhood, maybe your elementary school gets more attention than the elementary school in another area that doesn't have somebody who has kids going to that school. So this sort of process of drawing representational districts really it underlies our sort of whole representation situation. We're different than many countries. Many countries don't have representational districts. They have different methods of representation. Some of them have representational by districts that only are based upon prior existing political subdivisions. That was a process in the United States, but our population equality requirements have basically done away with that. A number of European countries have proportional representational systems or list systems based upon party membership. Those are all slightly different ways of doing this process. So the district system is almost universally the process in the United States. Technically, the Constitution doesn't require districts, but effectively from the founding of the country, we've had districts. So every state has congressional districts, which have more than one congressional seat. You don't have to redistrict congressional seats in Wyoming, but almost everywhere else, you're fighting about it. So hope that gives everybody a sort of an overview. If I can deal with questions, or if you want to go into the real details, I can wax on for a very long time, longer than you want to sit in your chairs, I'm sure.
No, that was a great overview, and we really appreciate it. And I've had the honor of actually working with you on redistricting some in Texas when I worked for a member of Congress from Texas. And we may have a couple of questions related to that just a little bit on at the end of the program. But I'm going to go ahead and go to Tova. Tova, I'm sure you've got some questions lined up.
Oh yeah, I always do. I could also ask as many as possible. This is such an interesting topic. But I wanted to start off by asking a bit about the potential negative effects of gerrymandering. Obviously, there are potential racial and partisan implications, but I was actually curious about like the deeper, maybe societal consequences of gerrymandering. So, for instance, I work at Harvard with different programs where we'll have like members of Congress come through and things like that. And one refrain I've heard is one of the reasons some people feel that politics has gotten so negative in recent years is that, because of gerrymandering, districts have gotten more partisan and less competitive by design. And so candidates are now running for the primary instead of running for the general election, because in the past it was like you needed to make yourself a bit more moderate so that you could appeal to a general election crowd. Whereas now you just need to appeal to the political party crowd, and then you can be kind of more assured of your victory because of gerrymandering. And so that maybe is a reason why there's certain more radical candidates, or politics has gotten more divisive, because you like literally don't need to appeal as much to the other side or to moderates in your party. So I was curious about that. And then also, if there's a gerrymandered district where and this works both ways from both political parties, but if you're a Democrat in a very Republican gerrymandered district or a Republican in a very Democrat gerrymandered district, Does that decrease voter turnout if people feel like their votes don't matter as much because the election's not as competitive? Does that create more apathy? Like what are like the deeper effects of this?
Sure. I've heard that argument about polarization, and a lot of people recently have looked at that issue. Certainly, our politics are more polarized now than they were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago under most measurements. But in fact, trying to link it to the redistricting process just doesn't support it, period. There's just no statistical support, and it's a large enough sample to look at to there really could be correlation if there was an effect, but there's no correlation. So what the process does, gerrymandering, strangely enough, it's a little different than what people assume it is. They assume it's a design to create safe districts. And in fact, let's use political gerrymandering. On the political gerrymandering side, people think that it's a process to create safe districts for one party or the other. And you can do that, but that's not generally, if you really want to maximize the political impact of a redistricting plan, you need to create districts that are more competitive. So creating a limited number of districts that are good for one party and the other party, it does create non-competitive seats, but that's not how generally you maximize the political power of one party. Usually what we're talking about here is an interest of one political party to get more seats in a representative chamber. There are many other issues, such as a lot of this is personal. You draw a district and you'll try, the majority and minority parties will sit down and frankly decide who they'd be happy to see leave the legislature. Yeah. Now it's not something that is much talked about, but there's a lot of sort of that type of thing. What members are not productive members, and so if we're going to redraw districts, now some of it is driven by geography and politics, and there's a limit to what you can do. But the notion that gerrymandering is driving this polarization and is driving the more partisan nature just doesn't bear out. Look to your social media, look to how you receive information about politics. And I would suggest to you, it's much more likely to be this siloing process of information. When I was your age, in a prior century, people got their information from 3 networks and 1 or 2 newspapers. And so there was people perceiving the world through similar lenses. Now I would suggest to you, if you watch Fox News and then change over and watch MSNBC, they each exist in a different planet than the other. And so it's not surprised that people who get their news through a single silo will get more and more polarized viewpoints than the other. So it really isn't, again, there are a number of good political science studies on this issue. It's an easy thing to say, and there are lots of members, I'm sure, who believe it. Just doesn't bear out. You look at the states with the more partisan drawn plans, and their memberships don't tend. Well, let me use an example. California has a bipartisan redistricting commission which draws their lines for the legislature and for Congress. Any study in California of the legislature and the congressional delegation will show that each of them are among the most, if not the most, partisan divide of any state legislative chamber in the country. Yet these are districts that are drawn theoretically, at least on a nonpartisan basis. So that's I sort of understand a discussion of the partisan drive there, but it just doesn't effectively bear out to be the case.
That's interesting. So I guess could you explain, are you saying that gerrymandering doesn't make districts less competitive?
No, it goes both ways. Sometimes it makes them more competitive. Sometimes it makes them less competitive. It's
So, like,
really very much a specific thing. If you will draw, if you're in a, let me use an example, Ohio. When they were drawing the last cycle, they had to lose 2 seats. So there were different ways of drawing those, have different effects. But basically, the 2 parties decided to make 2 of the districts. They had to eliminate 2 districts. So 1 Republican goes, 1 Democrat goes. And then that resulted in districts, follow-up district, a number of districts, which had to be much larger population-wise. And it was decided specifically to make these districts competitive because there's no way you could have gone one way or the other. But if you draw districts that are too Republican, as an example, that doesn't leave you with enough Republicans in an adjoining geographical area to make that district competitive. So it's kind of a tricky process, often gotten wrong, and especially wrong in the environment we're in right now, because we have such a changing dynamic of our electorate. I mean, the 2 parties are clearly in transition. And so trying to draw districts based upon partisanship gets more difficult when the coalitions are changing the way they are changing right now.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I was okay, and then I was also curious about I've heard a lot of people advocate for sort of instituting nonpartisan election commissions to try to draw districts. I was curious what you thought about this idea, because I guess the argument is that partisan gerrymandering is almost like a prisoner's dilemma, where if your opponent is gerrymandering
Sure.
and you don't, you're gonna lose, and that's not gonna bode well for you. So you're gonna gerrymander, and then that kind of makes the argument is that makes outcomes worse for everyone because you have all this litigation, and if there's long-term adverse effects, you have that too. So why not just have a third body come in and just do the election or the district redrawing so that you don't have to play this game? What would you say to that?
Sure. I do represent, as an example, I represent the Michigan Independent Redistricting Commission, which is not a nonpartisan commission, it's a bipartisan commission. I'm fundamentally opposed to the notion of nonpartisan commissions because that fundamentally requires you to try to identify a neutral in the war between the sexes. Who is that?
Right.
Exactly that person. Yeah, the nonpartisan is difficult. Anyone who's nonpartisan, I would suggest to you, doesn't have the expertise to draw. Bipartisan, where you have each side looking at the other side and reaching compromises, strikes me as a more logical way of doing it. I can assure you, since I am in lawsuit number 5, representing the Michigan Independent Redistricting Commission, that just being a commission does not avoid litigation. The issues are too controversial and too complex. Someone is always going to litigate. So the commissions can draw good plans. The commissions can draw bad plans. A lot depends upon, obviously, first and foremost, who's on the commission, and then second, what the criteria are of the commission. And it's difficult. As an example, the Michigan Independent Redistricting Commission has a requirement for partisan neutrality. It has a lower requirement for geographic political subdivisions. And there's a conflict between those, very substantial conflict between those, because of the different, the present political coalitions of the 2 parties have very different geography. Democratic voters are much more geographically concentrated in Republican voters. So plans that are driven principally by the concept of compactness and political subdivisions almost always appear to be, on most political analysis, somewhat biased to Republicans, because you get Democratic districts which have higher votes. I don't know if I explained that in a logical way, but it's the geographic reality of urban center Democratic voters and Republican farmers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you explained that really well. Unfortunately, even nonpartisan, bipartisan groups that have internal politics as well that I'm sure impact things. But do you mind also explaining the difference between a nonpartisan commission and a bipartisan commission? Because I think I made a mistake and just kind of used them interchangeably and didn't realize that there was such a difference. So could you explain that?
Sure. Some commissions are constituted with a very specific structure where the state legislative leaders will pick members, and they get, the Republican Senate leader and Republican House leader picks members, and the Democrat Senate leader and House leaders pick members, or the state party chairman pick members. A lot of different ways of doing it, people who are identified as partisan. They have identifiable partisan interests, and there's an effort to balance that commission with equal numbers. That's always a tricky question. And then with some type of tiebreaker is always the problem here. And so you have that type of process versus trying to create a commission that has people who specifically identify themselves as not a partisan participant. They don't belong to a political party. They don't, always vote for one candidate versus the other. The trouble, of course, with that is, in our partisan-driven electoral process, that type of person tends not to be, frankly, informed enough, maybe you would argue, or involved enough to be the person making these decisions. But that's it. And there are a lot of commissions which have equality of balance, and then they get a tiebreaker person, and that's always a tricky person. Who's the tiebreaker? Somebody picked by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Well, that can get you a nonpartisan person, maybe, but of course, in most of our states, the Supreme Court's elected on a partisan basis. So it's hard to come up with this equality, and it's hard to come up with people with the right type of background to do this, who don't have any partisan footprint whatsoever, who say I'm not partisan. So
right, in that case, yeah, that definitely seems like that would be difficult to assemble a nonpartisan commission. Are there any are there any actual nonpartisan commissions that
I'm trying to think if there's any that claim to be totally nonpartisan. Yeah, California, let me use California and Michigan. They have identifiable partisans on them. They also have people who identify as being nonpartisan. So there's an equality of membership, and a sprinkling of people who identify as nonpartisan. I think in Michigan, as an example, of course, I'm biased here because they're a client of mine. In Michigan, it's worked fairly well. The people who are identified as nonpartisan, I believe, generally are. They go through a very complicated process, and that includes drawing names out of a hat type situation. And so that process has worked. In California, it's widely believed that the nonpartisan members in California are simply members of the Democratic Party. And so now it's not as partisan as drawing plans through the California legislature, which is unambiguously partisan. But there's a general belief that it's really controlled by Democratic political allies. So it's hard to do. It's hard to do. You see this in like New Jersey. They have these commissions and they try to get a plan, and when they can't get a plan, the They need to identify a neutral person, and that's been difficult to do. And decade to decade, sometimes the Republicans are happy with the neutral person. Sometimes the Democrats are happy. Depends on which way your feet are pointed to get your view of the world.
Right. And then I'll sneak in one last question at the time I have. Since I think I just wanted to ask about the actual logistics of how redistricting works. Like I think it's so cool that, and Kathy, I want to ask you this too, since I didn't know that you had been so involved in redistricting. That's so interesting. So how, when you're sitting down to redistrict, what do you look at? What measurements do you use? What is take us inside that room? And what is
Sure.
that like?
You have the decennial census, which in non-COVID years gives you the numbers that go to Congress for the apportionment. Then, following the turn of the year, you get something called PL 94-171 data from the Census Bureau that goes out to all the states. The Census Bureau has something called the Tiger files. They are an electronic map of the United States at the census block level. And at the census block level, which is basically in cities, it would just be a city block, as an example, but are geographic units which provides the census numbers out to the states. And that the census numbers are total pop, voting age pop, and then racial data. And that's provided out to the states on an ongoing rolling basis at the beginning of the year. Again, in years where the census came out on time, the last cycle, COVID screwed all that up. So this electronic file then goes out in most states to the state legislature. In some places, it goes out to these commissions or other bodies. These electronic files then are put into a software program. There's really a couple different ones to them. A GSI program, geographic mapping programs, which permits you to construct districts block by block. In other words, one census block by another census block, and allows you to then get that same electronic program has geographic data, political subdivision data, and you sort of marry them all together. And then people sit in front of their PC and draw districts. Again, I hate to say how old I am because I can remember drawing districts with actual pieces of paper, adding machines and magic markers, but those haven't existed for a long time. So this electronic Tiger file map is plugged in the software. There's really two big vendors for this, but most states have fairly sophisticated geographic mapping systems for doing stuff like putting up power lines or roads. And this is used. And then that's usually then integrated with election data. Election data is available at a precinct level around the country. So if anybody had any doubt about what the political results of any particular plan is, all these plans will have plugged in election data so people can see what the impact of what they're doing. There'll also be, where particular members live and that type of data. So if you're talking about the most common way of doing it, then people are doing it exactly the same way that they would pass a piece of legislation. It goes to a redistricting committee. They'll have a series of hearings. They'll create draft plans. There'll be a negotiation process. People will be unhappy that their mother isn't in their district or their kid's school isn't in their district. And then people will you have to get a majority to get it out of the majority in each house, and usually have to get it signed by the governor. So it's a political process on a PC now. It used to be a mainframe on a PC, moving these little census blocks around. The census blocks are the smallest units of geography, and for congressional plans, you have to draw plans at the block level to get to the population deviation levels you need. Legislative plans you can usually draw at the precinct level, which tend to be larger and have more people than census blocks. You'll be surprised how interested a member is on which block goes in their district and which block doesn't go in their district. And a whole variety of reasons for it, ranging from their mother, ranging over to one of their major contributors, that type of thing. That you want to represent the person who's helping your campaign out. If they get moved out of your district, they might be more interested in helping somebody else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even if it's not partisan, it's always political, right?
Oh, it's always personal. It's more than political. This is a very personal process. You draw plans in somebody's, I repeatedly see processes where people are very interested in making sure that the leader of the other party doesn't get drawn out of the district, because almost no matter what the level of partisanship is of a chamber, you want to be in a position where you haven't done something personally to hurt the leader of the other party, so you'll be able to negotiate with them and work with them, because our political process, or at least our political, used to be one of accommodation to some degree always.
Interesting. Well, thank you for your time, and now I'll
Pleasure.
pass on to Jordan for some more questions.
So I have one question going backwards in the discussion from the political machine of it back to the philosophy coming out of the Constitution and behind our government as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Our representational republic, or however we want to categorize it, is built off the idea of representation. And our founders had debates about how many people can be represented by one representative. And we are far past those numbers, but still, notwithstanding, there is some sense of representing a community with each of these groups. There's some sense of that in the form of our government being necessary, that there is some linkage, some type of community in these districts. Does that discussion ever is that ever had in these legal and mechanistic discussions about separating districts?
Absolutely. That's it. You hit upon it, and sometimes people forget about it. This is a geographic process. It's a political process, but it's a geographic process. And all the time, that's a lengthy discussion of what pieces should be put together. Now, I've been joking about mothers and things like that, but there's really, there's a real interest in trying to draw representational districts that represent identifiable geographic communities. So often the substitute for that is political subdivisions. In other words, if you try to draw representational districts using subdivision lines, at least that gives you some sense of community in that sense. But there's absolutely, if you're in California, there's very much an interest in drawing districts that are in the Central Valley. The notion being, well, yeah, sure, you could stretch them across and get part of LA or whatever, but does that really make any sense? And the answer is, no, that doesn't make any sense. The farmers in the Central Valley have fundamentally different interests than folks making movies in California, in LA. So there, yes, all the time, that's when you have legislative chambers talking about criteria for drawing lines, there's always a discussion of trying to identify communities of interest, trying to draw districts that are compact. The compactness is important, because you want, as much as possible, you want the people who are being represented to understand who their representation, who it is. In other words, understanding the geography of a particular congressional district or legislative district is much easier if you're representing a particular community that people know. Township Y. I live in Township Y, so I know my legislator is this guy. If Township Y is divided into 3 or 4 different pieces, it becomes more difficult to link them to the interest of that particular township. So it's a process that involves population, but it certainly is driven to a large degree. We try to consolidate representational theory around the notion of geography too, to make the process more relatable. You can understand, not only you're talking about the member understanding who he's representing. If you're in, let me use Ohio, if you're in Ohio and you represent the area around Dayton, and if you represent that area, hopefully Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is in your district because that's the largest employer. It's hugely important thing in the legislative process. It's where the driver. So you want the representative of that district to have that piece to represent. So when somebody's talking in the Armed Services Committee, you've got someone who actually represents this particular community. And so the geography of it is in fact vital.
Thank you. So recently in our school district, just to make it a little more tangible, we have a school, huge school, biggest school in our area, and they redrew their line, their district line, to increase more wealthier families. And with schools, that is a very visible action. They get more money, they get more money from those wealthier families, higher enrollment. You know, the list goes on of how they gain from it. So it is very easy to say, probably shouldn't have done that. You probably should have given this other school they should be in their district. It's closer to the other school. Okay, so that's well and good. Okay, so we can understand that scenario, but it seems so difficult to really look at the political side and be able to bring it to the front and say, this is why this is gerrymandering, and really kind of proving it. So could you tell me the most common real arguments past, the mother that you want in your district? How do they, how is this brought to court? How is it talked about proving it?
Well, let me start with the simple observation. What's a gerrymander and what's not a gerrymander is a little bit about what is like trying to judge art. There is a little bit of what my eyes show versus what somebody else's eyes might show. But let me talk about one of the big areas of litigation is the Voting Rights Act and racial gerrymandering. That, the notion of what people are looking at, the Voting Rights Act requires the discrete minority communities have an equal opportunity, have a process that has an equal opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. And that process has played out through a series of court opinions, which impact greatly how representational districts are drawn across the country. There's a case out of North Carolina called Thornburg versus Jingles, which tells how the Voting Rights Act limits and impacts the drawing of representational districts for Congress and legislative chambers. And basically, it says there needs to be an equal opportunity, but there's a series of steps to identify what that means. And there are three parts. You have to have a geographically compact minority community that could be a majority in a district. In other words, something that you could draw a line around where that minority community could be Black, could be Hispanic, could be some different subdivision. When you say ethnic communities, there are a lot of different ways to look at that. But you have an identifiable racial or ethnic minority that's geographically compact enough to be a majority in a district, that the electorate is polarized. What that means is one community votes one way, almost united, and the other community, so that's sort of divided. You have, let me use African American, perfect example. In most areas of the country, African American community will support Democratic candidates about 90%, give or take 10%, but about 90%. White community nowhere near that. So there's polarization. The third step of the process is whether or not the white majority group votes sufficiently as a block to keep the minority community from having a reasonable opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. Those are the three preconditions to making a valid Voting Rights Act claim. Then you have to show that the so-called totality of the circumstances support the notion that the minority community is discriminated against. Their right to vote is diluted because of this process. So that is the most common litigation and the most common starting point in line drawing is looking, if you're drawing for a state, first thing you're looking at, if I'm talking to a legislature, is, okay, do we have minority communities that are geographically compact? And are they polarized in their area from the white community? And you begin the process of looking at those districts and making a determination as to whether those districts need to be created into the Voting Rights Act. Now, just to make your head hurt, there is a countervailing argument here, which is, it's called the Equal Protection Clause, which effectively says that the use of race can't be a predominant factor in the drawing of legislative districts. So how do you make sure you comply with the requirements of Section 2? At the same time, you're not making race the predominant factor in drawing districts. That issue's back at the Supreme Court again from Louisiana today, a matter of fact. Various pleadings were filed. That's a difficult decision. It's a difficult concept to try to balance those two things. How much you can use race in the redistricting process without it being unconstitutional. How much you have to use race to ensure that the minority community isn't being blocked from equal participation in the process. That's killed, I would have said killed thousands of trees, but most of it's electrons now. But thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of pages of briefs on that subject. I think tens of thousands have come off my desk. So those are driving issues in the process. And what's the minority community that you're looking at, the racial? I mean, when you talk about Hispanic community, well, I will suggest to you that there really isn't a Hispanic community. You've got to put plural on the end of it because we have a lot of different Hispanic communities. Puerto Rican community in the United States votes different than the Cuban American community. They vote different than the Ecuadorian community. One of the largest group coming into many areas in the country right now is Ecuadorians. Everybody raised their hand if they knew that was the case. I certainly didn't know it until recently. Because the collapse of the Ecuadorian government. And they're very different people than Chicano people from Mexico. They have very different political backgrounds. They have very different economic stages. So trying to identify how to do all these is just blindingly difficult. And how you move the chairs around, of course, depends on who gets to sit in at the back end. So this is real political power, which relates to real life impact on people. If you're talking about the schools, what could be more real as to which school you go to? And so that's, the stakes are big in this.
Thank you very much. I'll pass to Kathy now. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jill and Jorn, and thank you, Tova, for your great questions. And Mark, we just
I talk too much.
No, it's a complicated issue. It's hard to get it down into sound bites. We want to take a minute to recognize the students and teachers that are with us today. D'Angela Hines from the Emerald Coast Christian Academy, Hope Mucklow with homeschool students, and Cami Waynouse with a homeschool student. So welcome. And if you have, if you're a teacher with students watching and we didn't give you a shout out, type something in the chat. We'll try to do that here in the last few minutes. We also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. This program airs Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone in Las Vegas listening. So Mark, one thing I remember back from Texas redistricting is there was always a real fear of members of Congress just getting their house in their district.
Sure.
And one point that I thought is interesting is it's not actually required for a member of Congress to live in the congressional district by law. Is that true?
That is true. You do not need to live in your congressional district. It does vary from state to state whether or not you need to live in your legislative district. But in Congress now, all you have to be is a resident of the state.
But of course, members want their district. Another thing I remember to Tova's point, and then we will just get to audience questions real quick. But I do remember, just members of Congress sometimes having, as Tova mentioned, a very non-competitive district, like an 80% maybe district. And the question would always be posed to those members, how low are you willing to go? How, will you take a 55% district so we can take Republican voters out of your district and move them to another district to maybe flip a district that's Democrat, maybe flip it to Republican? And so I think really whoever the party in power that's drawing the lines tends to want to have as many competitive districts as possible so they can get more seats, and then make the non-competitive districts be the opposite party, which I thought was always interesting.
That tends not to be the view of the incumbent members.
Right.
My experience, I got an 80% district. You could take it down to 78% Republican district. I'll be happy to do that. But anything else, these are the people who love me and I'm representing them. You shouldn't be moving them out of my district to bring in people who might not like me. That I've met very few, if any, members who want to give up people who vote for them if they can avoid it.
Yeah. Well, Mark DeRoba asks a really interesting question. He says, are state representatives solely responsible for proposing changes to districting, or can there be other influences to bring about changes, such as community grassroots pressure? For our listeners who want to get involved in the redistricting process, is there space for them to do that? Is there mechanisms
sure,
for that?
Absolutely. All the redistricting commissions in the state all have, in the various states who draw redistricting plans, all have public input. They all have public hearing. They all have access through electronically for it. All the legislative chambers will have hearing. This is like a piece of legislation. So they will have hearings around the state. And people, I've heard people say, oh, well, they have these, but these are just show. And the answer is, in my experience, no, that's not right. These are elected people generally. If you've got a good reason why they should do it some other way, the number, this will make your head hurt, but I'll just say it. The numbers of different ways you can draw legislative districts is so large, then there are more ways to draw a legislative plan for, say, the House in Ohio than there are stars in the universe. Yeah, I only know this because we've got the supercomputers who are doing this now. So there's a lot of people doing sort of electronic line drawing and trying to get people out of this process. But the number of different ways you can do this is just a number larger than we can imagine, literally larger than you can imagine. And so all those changes have some effect. So there are, if you think something should be somewhere else, if you come up and you say that to the people drawing, often you can directly affect the process. So this is a process that's open. Now, I'm not claiming that it's totally open in the sense that whatever you want, you're going to get, and that's not the case. But often you can have more effect than you think you can in showing up the hearings, reaching out to the members. The people are willing to listen. And there's a lot of flex in the joint, obviously, on how the districts look.
Well, thank you. And that's a great way to end, is just to encourage people to get involved in this process, because the more we, the people, get involved, the more open and transparent it will be, and we can have an impact and make a difference. So we want to thank you so much for your time today. And we want to thank our audience, and we want to encourage everybody to come back next week, as we're going to be talking about a case before the Supreme Court that's dealing with the Trump tax cuts, which ought to be super interesting. So thank you, Mark, for this fascinating episode and sharing all your knowledge. And
My pleasure.
just want to, Jewel and Jorn or Tova, any parting words?
Just thank you so much for breaking down this really complicated topic. And I love the series because I feel like it helps us see past the headlines and actually get a view for ourselves. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.